You hear it first, the bell. It cuts through the mountain air like a knife through silk, a sound so ancient and hollow it feels like the earth itself is crying out. 1, 2, 3 times it rings, each peal slower than the last, as if the metal knows what's coming, as if even bronze can feel dread. You're standing in a stone corridor that smells of incense and old prayers, where the walls are so thick they've swallowed centuries of whispers. The light filtering through narrow windows is the color of amber and dust, casting long shadows that dance like spirits across worn flagstones. Your breath clouds in the cold air, your fingers are numb, and then you see them. 23 women in habits the color of storm clouds, kneeling in a circle in the chapel. Their heads are bowed. Their hands are clasped so tightly their knuckles have turned white as bone. They're praying, but not the prayers you've heard before. These are different, desperate, the kind of prayers that claw their way up from the deepest chambers of the soul. The ones you only speak when you know God might not answer in time. Outside, you hear something else now. Footsteps, dozens of them, hundreds. The crunch of boots on gravel, the metallic whisper of swords being drawn, the guttural commands in a language that sounds like thunder rolling across a distant plain. The Empire has arrived at their door, and it has not come to pray. You watch as the eldest among them, Sister Miriam, though you don't know her name yet, lifts her head. Her face is carved from determination and terror in equal measure. Her eyes, dark as the bottom of a well, meet yours through time itself, and in them you see a question that will echo across 3 centuries. How far would you go to remain faithful to yourself when the entire world demands you surrender? The bell rings one last time, and then silence. What happened next was buried so deep that empires rose and fell without speaking its name. Historians erased it, churches hid it, governments denied it. For 300 years, this moment existed only in fragments. A scorched letter here, a coded diary entry there, whispers passed down through generations like a disease no one wanted to catch. But you're here now. You found your way to this threshold. You're standing at the edge of a story that powerful men spent lifetimes trying to silence. If you turn away now, this story dies again, just like it did the first time. The question is, will you let it? To understand what brought an empire to the door of 23 women, you need to go back to when the Ottoman Empire was not just a power, it was the power. The year is 1716, and the world is a chessboard where sultans and kings move entire nations like pawns. Constantinople, Istanbul, sits at the center of it all, a city where 3 continents meet and where gold flows like water through the Grand Bazaar. Minarets pierce the sky like fingers pointing toward heaven, and beneath them, in marble palaces and torchlit chambers, decisions are made that will reshape the map of the known world. The empire stretches from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, from the shores of the Black Sea to the deserts of North Africa. It is vast, it is ancient, it is merciless. But empires, no matter how mighty, are always hungry. And in 1716, the Ottoman appetite has turned westward, toward the fractured kingdoms of the Balkans, toward the Christian territories that huddle in the shadow of its expansion, like sheep sensing the wolf. In the borderlands between Orthodox and Ottoman, between cross and crescent, Tensions have been simmering for decades. Villages switch hands like currency. Families flee in the night. Churches become mosques, become ruins. It's a slow-motion apocalypse, the kind where you don't notice the walls closing in until there's no room left to breathe. The trigger comes in the spring. A Serbian uprising. An Ottoman merchant caravan attacked on the road to Belgrade. Retaliations and counter-retaliations that spiral into accusations of espionage, of hidden weapons, of secret allegiances. Both sides claim righteousness. Both sides claim self-defense. And in the gap between their truths, violence rushes in like water through a broken dam. The Sultan issues an edict. All religious institutions in contested territories must prove their loyalty to the empire or face administrative restructuring, a bureaucratic phrase that means exactly what you think it means: conversion, confiscation, erasure. For most monasteries and convents, the choice is impossible but clear. They comply, they convert, they disappear into history with barely a whisper. But high in the Dalmatian mountains, built into the face of a cliff that overlooks a valley so green it looks painted, there sits the Convent of the Sacred Vigil. It has stood for 400 years, through crusades and plagues, through earthquakes that toppled cities, and winters that starved entire provinces. The women who live there have taken vows of silence, prayer, and eternal witness. They are keepers of an ancient tradition, guardians of sacred texts, protectors of something they believe is worth more than their own lives. When the Sultan's decree reaches them, carried by a messenger who climbs the mountain path for 2 days to deliver it, the abbess reads it once. Then she burns it. She burns it. And with that single act of defiance, with that small flame consuming that particular piece of paper, she sets in motion a collision that will echo through centuries. But in a convent high above the valley, 23 women were about to face that empire's shadow, and they would not bend. Their names should be written in gold across the sky. Instead, they exist only in fragments, in records that weren't supposed to survive, in letters hidden in walls and discovered by accident 3 centuries too late. Sister Miriam was the eldest, 62 years old, with hands gnarled from a lifetime of grinding herbs into medicine and copying manuscripts by candlelight until her eyes watered. She'd entered the convent at 15, fleeing an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age. Within these walls, she'd found something the outside world could never give her, a purpose that was hers alone. She was the keeper of the library, guardian of texts so old they predated the Ottoman Empire itself. Medical treatises from Byzantine physicians, philosophical dialogues from Greek scholars, illuminated gospels that glowed like jewels in the dark. She knew what the administrative restructuring really meant. She'd seen it happen before, in other places. They would take the books first, then everything else. Sister Elena was 34, a former lady-in-waiting to a Venetian duchess who'd chosen the veil over a political marriage. She played the organ, and on quiet evenings, her music would drift down the mountainside like smoke, so beautiful that shepherds in the valley below would stop and listen. She had a brother in the Ottoman court, a convert, a pragmatist who'd changed his name and his faith to survive. He'd written to her twice, begging her to do the same. She'd burned both letters unread. Then there was Sister Anna, barely 19, who'd arrived at the convent only 2 years prior. She'd walked barefoot through snow to get there, fleeing a village that had been razed to the ground in a border skirmish. She still flinched at loud noises, still woke up screaming sometimes. The convent was the first place she'd felt safe since she was a child. Now, safety was about to become a memory. Sister Josepha, the herbalist, who could cure fevers and set bones and deliver babies. She was 51 and had hands that never stopped moving, always grinding, mixing, preparing. The villagers below depended on her medicines. Twice a month, they'd send someone up the mountain trail with gifts, eggs, cloth, olive oil, and she'd send them back with remedies. If the convent fell, where would they go? Sister Katerina, 47, who'd been a spy once in another life, who'd smuggled messages for the Venetian Republic and knew 5 languages and could pick any lock in the empire if given enough time. She never spoke about her past, but everyone knew she could leave whenever she wanted. She could slip away in the night, disappear into any city from here to Rome. She stayed anyway. There were 18 others, each with a story, each with a reason for being there that ran deeper than religion, deeper than politics. Some were hiding from abusive families, some from the law, some from themselves. The convent was a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where the world's violence couldn't reach you, where you could rebuild yourself from the ruins of whatever came before. Or so they thought. On the morning the first Ottoman soldiers appeared on the mountain path, Sister Miriam gathered them all in the chapel. She was calm. She explained the situation in a voice that didn't shake. The empire wanted their submission. They would be given a choice convert and accept Ottoman protection, or face the consequences. There would be a delegation arriving within the week. Envoys, negotiators, men with official seals and written orders. "We will refuse," she said simply. Sister Elena asked what the consequences would be. Sister Miriam looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Everything." They voted, all 23 of them, one by one, standing in a circle in that ancient chapel with its Byzantine frescoes peeling from the walls. Not a single hand rose in favor of submission. Not one. Some wept as they voted. Some were stone-faced. Sister Anna's hand shook so badly she could barely lift it, but she lifted it. They thought the war would never reach them. They were wrong. And yet, knowing they were wrong, they chose to stand anyway. That's the part that destroys you. Not that they were naive, but that they were fully terribly aware of what was coming, and they looked it in the eye and said no. They had names, voices. Dreams don't let history erase them again. The delegation arrived on a Tuesday. 7 men on horseback, flanked by 20 soldiers in polished armor that caught the morning sun and threw it back like daggers. They rode up the mountain path single file, their horses' hooves clattering against stone, echoing off the cliff face. The lead envoy was a man named Mehmet Pasha, a court official known for his diplomatic skill and, when diplomacy failed, for his efficiency in implementing the Sultan's will. Sister Miriam met them at the gate. She did not invite them inside. The negotiation, if you could call it that, lasted less than an hour. Mehmet Pasha was courteous, even gentle in his phrasing. He explained the benefits of compliance protection, funding, a place within the empire's religious structure. He spoke of pragmatism, of survival, of the changing times. He did not mention what would happen if they refused, but the soldiers standing behind him did that talking for him. 20 men, 20 swords. Sister Miriam listened politely. When he finished, she thanked him for making the journey. Then she said, We will not submit. Mehmet Pasha's courtesy evaporated like morning dew. You understand what you're choosing? Yes. You understand that I have orders. I understand perfectly. There was a long silence. The wind whistled through the mountain pass, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. One of the soldiers shifted his weight, hand drifting toward his sword. Mehmet Pasha studied Sister Mariam's face. Whatever he saw there, conviction or madness, or some combination of both, made him nod slowly. 3 days, he said. You have 3 days to reconsider. After that, I cannot protect you from what comes next. He rode back down the mountain. Sister Mariam watched him go. Then she returned to the chapel and told the others to prepare. For what? Sister Anna asked, her voice small. For witness, Sister Mariam said. They spent 3 days in continuous prayer. Not the rote recitations of daily office, but something rawer, more primal. They sang until their voices broke. They prayed until exhaustion dragged them to the stone floor. And in between they wrote letters, testimonies, accounts of who they were and why they'd chosen this. Sister Elena wrote to her brother, though she knew he'd never receive it. Sister Josepha wrote down every medical recipe she knew, every healing practice, every secret of her trade. Sister Mariam spent 40 hours transcribing the most important texts in the library onto fresh vellum, working by candlelight until her hands cramped into claws. If the empire was coming for their knowledge, they would scatter it first, hide it, ensure it survived. On the night of the 3rd day, they buried everything. In the garden, under cover of darkness, they dug holes and wrapped their manuscripts in oilcloth, and lowered them into the earth like corpses. They scattered the soil, planted flowers over the spots, erased every trace. Let them burn the building, Sister Mariam said, dirt under her fingernails, face streaked with mud and tears. Let them take our bodies. The words will outlive us all. The soldiers returned at dawn. Not 7, not 2,200. They came like a tide, flooding up the mountain path in waves of steel and fury. This was no longer a diplomatic mission. This was a statement, a demonstration. The Sultan's patience had run out, and what came now was the alternative to compliance. The gates splintered under battering rams within minutes. Sister Katerina, the former spy, had rigged a few surprises, a tripwire here, a loose stone there that bought them perhaps an extra 5 minutes. 5 minutes that felt like both an eternity and an eye blink. The sisters had barricaded themselves in the chapel. They'd moved the altar to block the door, piled pews against the windows. It was futile, and they knew it. But there's something human in the act of building a last defense, even when you know it won't hold. Even when you know it's just a gesture against the dark. The soldiers broke through the chapel doors at midday. Sunlight poured in behind them, haloing them in gold, making them look like angels come to carry out divine judgment. Perhaps that's how they saw themselves. Sister Mariam stood at the center of the chapel, her sisters in a circle around her. They were still praying, not desperately now, but with a strange, eerie calm. They'd passed through terror into something beyond it, acceptance, maybe, or transcendence, or simply the recognition that this was the moment all their vows had been preparing them for. This is your final chance, Mehmet Pasha called from the doorway. Submit or face the consequences of your rebellion. Sister Mariam's response was to begin singing. It was a hymn so old it predated the schism between East and West, a melody that had been sung in this place for 4 centuries, by women long dead, in a language half forgotten. Her voice, cracked and worn as it was, filled the chapel with something that felt like light. One by one, her sisters joined her. 23 voices rising in harmony, thin and imperfect and utterly, devastatingly human. They sang while the soldiers advanced. They sang while hands grabbed them, dragged them apart, forced them to their knees. They sang until they couldn't sing anymore. What happened next took 6 hours. I won't describe it in detail, not because you can't handle it, but because they deserve more than to be reduced to their suffering. Enough to say that the Ottoman Empire, in its wisdom and might, spent 6 hours proving to 23 unarmed women in a mountaintop convent that it was stronger than they were. By evening, the convent was burning. Black smoke rose into a sky going purple with dusk, visible for miles. In the valley below, villagers watched in silence, knowing what it meant, knowing they might be next. Of the 23 sisters, 17 were dead. 6 survived, though 2 of those would die from their injuries within days. The survivors were marched down the mountain in chains, bound for Constantinople, for conversion or slavery or whatever fate the empire had decided they'd earned through their defiance. Sister Miriam was not among the survivors. She died in the chapel, her hands still clutching a fragment of a psalm she'd been trying to save. Her last words, according to a soldier who would later confess them to a priest, were not a prayer or a curse. They were simply, "Remember us." The empire burned the library. Every manuscript, every medical text, every illuminated gospel. 400 years of accumulated knowledge went up in smoke in a single afternoon. They burned it all, and then they burned the building, and then they dynamited the foundation so thoroughly that within a decade, travelers passing through the valley would look up at the mountainside and wonder if there'd ever been anything there at all. They stood their ground with nothing but conviction. The least we can do is keep their story standing. For 3 centuries, the convent of the Sacred Vigil was a ghost story, a legend whispered in taverns, a cautionary tale parents told children about the price of defiance. Most assumed it was apocryphal, one of those stories that feels too dramatic to be real, too perfectly tragic to be anything but fiction. The Ottoman Empire classified all records of the incident. The surviving sisters disappeared into the vast machinery of the empire, their fates unknown. The families of the dead were given no bodies to bury, no confirmation, nothing but silence. The church, embarrassed by its inability to protect its own, quietly stopped mentioning the convent in official histories. Within 50 years, even the location was disputed. By the 19th century, most scholars assumed the entire event had been exaggerated, if it happened at all. And then, in 2003, everything changed. A team of archaeologists, working on a completely different excavation in the Dalmatian highlands, stumbled across something unexpected. They were mapping medieval trade routes when their ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly on a cliff-face structural remains that shouldn't have been there. When they investigated, they found stones. Lots of them. Precisely cut, deliberately placed, the unmistakable signature of Byzantine construction. They'd found the convent, or what was left of it. The empire had been thorough in its destruction, but stone is stubborn. Foundations remain, Cellars survive. And in this case, so did something else. The garden. It had become wild over the centuries, overrun with brambles and mountain roses, but the soil remembered. As the archaeologists carefully cleared away 300 years of growth, they began finding things. Clay pots sealed with wax, lead boxes, and inside them, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously survived, the manuscripts. Not all of them, maybe a third of what Sister Miriam and her sisters had buried that last night, but enough to prove the story was real, enough to put names to the dead, enough to read, in Sister Elena's elegant hand, her final letter to her brother. By the time you read this, if you ever read this, I will have chosen something you could not understand. You chose survival. I do not judge you for it, but know that some things matter more than survival. Some things demand we stand, even when standing means falling. I hope you find peace in your choice, brother. I have found mine. The discovery made international news for about a week. Then it was buried again. Not literally this time, but in the vast ocean of information that is the modern world. A few academic papers, a small museum exhibit in Zagreb, a footnote in a revised history of the Ottoman Balkans. The manuscripts are still being translated. The medical texts alone have proved fascinating. Some of the healing practices were centuries ahead of their time. The philosophical treatises challenge assumptions about medieval women's intellectual lives. The personal letters are. They're devastating. Reading them is like hearing voices from the bottom of a well, calling up through time, desperate to be heard. In 2018, a team of forensic archaeologists returned to the site and found human remains in the chapel ruins. 17 individuals, all female, all showing signs of violent death. DNA analysis is ongoing, but the bones tell their own story. One woman, likely Sister Miriam, based on age and position, was found with her hand still extended, reaching toward what would have been the altar. Reaching. Even in death, even after 300 years, still reaching. The site is protected now. There's a small memorial installed by the Croatian government in 2019. It lists the names they've been able to verify: Sister Miriam, Sister Elena, Sister Josefa, and 12 others. 6 names remain unknown. 6 women who stood and fought and died for something they believed in. And we don't even know what to call them. But here's what haunts me. What should haunt you? This almost didn't survive. If those archaeologists had been mapping their route 50 meters to the left, they would have missed it entirely. If Sister Miriam hadn't thought to bury those manuscripts, we'd have nothing but legend. If even one element had gone differently, these women would have been erased completely. Their defiance turned to silence, their courage to dust. If you've watched this far, maybe you know why these voices still matter. Don't just watch, remember. The Ottoman Empire lasted another 2 centuries after the Convent of the Sacred Vigil burned. It conquered more territories, won more battles, accumulated more power and wealth and influence. It grew so vast that the sun never set on its holdings. It was, by every measurable metric, one of the most successful empires in human history. And yet, here we are, talking about 23 women in a mountain convent who said no. The empire fell, collapsed under its own weight, torn apart by the very forces it had tried to suppress. Today, It exists only in history books and archaeological sites, and the borders it drew that still cause conflicts a century after its dissolution. But those women, those 23 women who had nothing but conviction they endured, not their bodies, not their building, not even most of their words, but the fact of them, the stubborn, immovable fact of their resistance, that survived. There's a lesson there, though not the one you might expect. This isn't a story about martyrdom or religious devotion or the glory of dying for your beliefs. It's simpler and harder than that. It's about the math of empire versus individual, about the obscene imbalance between institutional power and human will, about what happens when 200 soldiers with swords show up at the door of 23 unarmed women and the women don't blink. The empire won that day. Of course it did. It had numbers, weapons, authority, the entire machinery of state violence at its disposal. But empires always win the immediate battle. That's not the point. The point is that 300 years later, I'm telling you their names. The point is that archaeologists still excavate their home. The point is that their manuscripts are in museums, their letters are being translated, their bones are being studied with reverence and care. The point is that they matter, still, despite everything. And Mehmet Pasha, the envoy who led the assault? He's a footnote. One line in one document, in one archive, that most historians will never bother to read. The empire that sent him? Gone. The sultan who gave the orders? Barely remembered outside of specialist academic circles. But Sister Miriam reaching for the altar, Sister Elena's letter to her brother, Sister Josepha's medical recipes, Sister Anna, 19 years old and terrified and standing anyway. They echo. That's what makes this a scandal. Not the violence empires have always been violent. Not the religious persecution that's as old as religion itself. The scandal is that 23 women nearly vanished from history altogether, and the only reason they didn't is because they buried their words in a garden and hoped. Hoped that someday someone would dig deep enough. Hoped that someday someone would care enough to listen. Hoped that someday their story would matter to someone who wasn't there. Someone like you. You've just witnessed one of the battles that shook history not with cannons, but with courage. If you're still here and haven't subscribed, ask yourself, would you have remembered them if no one told their story? Because that's the final question, isn't it? Not whether they were right or wrong, not whether their choice was wise or foolish, not even whether their sacrifice meant anything in the grand sweep of history. The question is simpler. Will you remember them? Will you carry their names forward even just a little further? Will you think about them when you face your own moment of choice, your own crossroads between compliance and resistance? Will you recognize that what happened on that mountain in 1716 is still happening? In different forms, in different places, to different people who deserve to be more than footnotes? The empire tried to hide this story, literally burned it to ash, and for 3 centuries, it worked. But Sister Miriam bet on something the empire didn't understand, that truth, even buried, even broken, even scattered across centuries, like seeds, has a way of taking root. She bet on you. Don't let her down.